The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus said to Nicodemus, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him might not perish, but might have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him will not be condemned, but whoever does not believe has already been condemned, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the verdict, that the light came into the world, but people preferred darkness, because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light, and does not come towards the light, so that his works might not be exposed. But whoever lives the truth comes to the light, so that his works may be clearly seen as done in God. The Gospel of the Lord. Just a little reminder. God loves everyone, but prefers fruits of the Spirit over religious nuts. Somebody gave me a whole list of those. I figured I'd start using them. I gave you the one about the, you think you're having a bad day, just look at Moses. He started out as a basket case, right? It's all in there. So I'll be reading some of those things to you as Lent and Easter come, especially during the Easter season when we're supposed to laugh. Anyways, last year I had started a reflection on the capital sins, and I never got around to finishing them because time kind of went by, as it does. We're in the fourth week of Lent now. We have the fifth week, then we have Palm Sunday, and then we have Easter. I mean, we're almost there. It isn't even that far off. And I haven't had a chance to even talk about the capital sins. It's been a custom throughout the centuries, of course, that one of the things that is talked about during the season of Lent is the capital sins. To remind us certainly that there is such a thing, but it was a custom throughout the centuries and so on, to do that, to at least once a year to take the time to refresh our minds a little bit to help us to understand. And somebody asked me the other day, Father, you talked about it last year, but you never finished it. I said, you're absolutely correct, and maybe I can do a little bit of that while we still have some time left. Sin is something that the human being really doesn't want to hear much about these days. He'd much rather just be comfortable in his own life and his own style and his own way of doing things, and so on and so on. He doesn't like to be told that what he's doing isn't absolutely correct, or that it falls under the category of sin, whether it's venial, mortal, or whether it's a fault, a vice, or so on and so on. But reality is reality. If we're not going to hear it from the pulpit, where are we going to hear it? People aren't going to tell us about it. People love to gossip, which is a sin, but they won't tell us about sin. They'd rather let us go on with our lives just the way they are. Of course, it's not the job of us to judge other people, certainly, but there are times when we have to, out of charity, we have to speak up and say something in charity to another person about whatever it might be. So last year, I started on pride, and it took me 45 minutes to get through all the different facets of pride. It's like a diamond, except it's coal. It has all these different angles, and I went through all of them, and time slipped by. So I'm not going to do that again, but before I do start, I will kind of review a little bit the sin of pride, just so we're familiar with it, also called self-love, the sin most hated by God. But people, one of the most common questions that I get during the season of Lent, how come, Father, we don't eat meat on Fridays? What is the reason for that? Why do we cover the images and the statues and so on and so on? Most Catholics couldn't give you an answer if they tried. Maybe they think it's what's behind curtain number 1. That's a crucifix, of course. What's behind veil number 2? statue of the Blessed Mother, and so on. But everything has its purpose, and everything has its reasons for being there. Now, one of the elements that has been forgotten, and why we certainly fast on Fridays or abstain from eating meat on Fridays, is to develop within ourselves a greater hunger for the meat of God, Jesus Christ. When Jesus Christ spoke at the Last Supper, in the Gospel of John, in the Greek, the translation that we have just says, "Take this, all of you, and eat of it." But the interesting thing of it being is Christ uses a very, very different word. He uses a word which is very, very descriptive. He uses a word which translates into English to gnaw. And all of us know what that means if you're eating a chicken bone, a chicken leg, or whatever, to gnaw on something. If you're eating ribs, to gnaw on ribs. But that's the word that Christ uses. Our translation to eat is a little bit weak. I mean, we do get a sense of idea, certainly, and thanks be to God, we do understand, of course, that we're invited to eat the mystery of God, but Christ makes it very clear that this is absolute reality. We are invited to eat the living God, to gnaw the living God, to partake of the living God, to partake of the flesh of the living God, Jesus Christ. So on Fridays, we don't eat meat, so we develop our hunger for the meat of God. And in the Middle Ages, it was a custom that people certainly didn't eat meat, but they went to Mass on Fridays. Outside of the Stations of the Cross, they went to Mass because they understood this was their meat, Jesus Christ. So we abstain from eating meat on Fridays. Now, many people have fallen away from the idea that Fridays outside of Lent are days when we can eat meat, but nothing could be further from reality. People don't understand anymore. Fridays are always days when we don't eat meat, 52 weeks out of the year, unless it's a feast day. The church has never changed that teaching, has never changed that directive. But yet most of us eat meat on Fridays like, who cares? Because nobody reminds us of the reality of the fact that the American Bishops' Conference said something which was very, very confusing and confused a lot of people. And when they read it, they think, oh, they're telling us we're going to meet on Friday, but that's not what they're saying at all. The directive simply says, if you have a reason for eating meat on Friday, then you have to offer something else in sacrifice. And it gives a couple of different reasons, like if you have guests coming over, and maybe one of them doesn't eat fish, or maybe they're allergic to fish, and you got guests coming over and you want to cook something like chicken or whatever, you may do so on a Friday. But then you must offer something else in reparation. You must offer another sacrifice on Friday. Pray the rosary. Go to Mass. Pray the Stations of the Cross. You must do something on Friday if you eat meat. But you must have a good reason and a good excuse. And believe me, throughout the years, I've been a priest for 17 years, every time I mention this, I get people coming at me with red faces like tomatoes. Father, that can't be right. I think you misinterpreted that. No, I didn't. I'm sorry. We covered it in school. We talked about the wording. And it is still the common practice of the universal church not to eat meat on Friday. That is every Friday of the year. But we don't do it. During Lent, certainly it's a mortal sin. Something I have to go to confession for before I receive communion if I eat meat on Friday. But that's the only time we abstain from eating meat. So anyways, that's part of the reason why we abstain from eating meat on Fridays, just so you have a sense of awareness. The idea is it develops a hunger for God, a hunger to receive Him more often. into our beings. And the reason, of course, we use the color purple. The purple color back in the time of the Romans was, of course, a color of royalty and dignity. Purple is now a color of repentance to remind us that we are in a season of penance. And people will often ask me also, Father, why do we cover the statues? Well, it's not so, like I said, it's not a game that we're playing, what's behind curtain number one. But the idea behind it basically is very simple. We're in the middle of a season where we're stripping away from ourselves those things we need to get rid of. And covering the statues is a reminder that we too are cutting ourselves off from things, the world, bad words, other things, and so on and so on. Now, many parishes, people have always asked, Father, why this particular weekend? Why not? You go to some parishes, do it the first week. Some don't do it till the fifth week, and so on and so on. You see, we still have the holy water. How come we don't have sand there? How come we don't take it out? You know, every parish and every priest does it a little bit differently. We were taught in the seminary, and you can read the rubrics and the instructions as well. By the fourth Sunday of Lent, which is today, everything is covered, which has been uncovered until before today. And by next week, the holy water will be out, because we're in fifth Sunday, then we go to Palm Sunday. And then we start heading towards Holy Week and Easter and all of that. So that's why we do what we do. The covering is a reminder to us that we too are stripping ourselves, we're stripping away from ourselves those things that shouldn't be in our souls, those bad habits, those vices, those things which keep us from loving God and keep us distant from God. So that's what the season of Lent is, a season of grace. It's when God pours out many graces. I can't even begin to tell you how many confessions I've heard in the last 5 weeks alone of people who haven't been to confession in over 40 years. Some 30 years, some 20 years, some a couple of years. And I always ask him, what brings you here today? I want to get closer to God. Should I come to confession? Because God is pouring out his graces during this season specifically for that. And I always welcome them home. I say, welcome home after all these years. It doesn't matter how far we get away from God. It's only one step back. Confession. But please don't be like the lady who said to me one day, Father, I have been to confession in 20 years. I don't have any sins. I said, well, I can name you 20 of them right now because you have to go to confession at least once a year. That's 20 sins right there. All of them serious. You shouldn't be receiving communion. But I told her, I said, you know what? I think the church must have made a big fat mistake calling the Blessed Mother the Immaculate Conception, conceived without sin, because I'm looking at it. You're not committed any sins in 20 years. You must be the Immaculate Conception. I better call the Pope in Rome. I better ask him to redefine that statement, because the Immaculate Conception is standing in front of me. Oh, Father. I said, well, you know what I'm talking about. That's the way people look at things. I don't commit any sins. I don't have any faults. Oh, my gosh. Quit it. We all have faults. We all have failings. We all have sins of some type or another, whether venial or mortal. And let me just kind of give you what I talked about last year, just to give you an idea of the sin of pride, which has so many facets. And I'm not going to go through each one and explain them like I did last year. I'm just going to go through them, sort of kind of give you a little bit of what comes out of it. The sin most hated by God, of course, is pride. It sits in the will. Okay, the human being has what we call 3 higher faculties within his soul: the memory, the intellect, and the will. At any moment of any given day, even in our dreams, we're operating through memories, we're operating in our intellect, or we're operating in our will. Our will is what is supposed to love God, but love rests there. Love for things, love for sin, love for this, love for that, love for everything but God. So self-love dominates in the will, so therefore pride sits in the same place. It's not in the memory, it's not in the intellect, it's in the will. It's the most difficult sin to overcome because it's so close to us that St. Thomas Aquinas says that pride dies in a human being 6 months after we're buried. That's how close we are to it. Our lives are filled with it. We don't even realize it. But let me just kind of run through this. Self-centeredness. Living one's life for oneself. Self-focus, self-centeredness. Strong self-will. We've all been around these kind of people. Strong self-will. They're very difficult to be around. Self-pity and oversensitivity. This is a person who becomes very sensitive about things that are said to them emotionally and so on and so on. Self-complacency, which leads to vanity. Pride of superiority, which really is more of a pride to want to control others, to control other human beings. We're living, I'm not even sure this is a problem of the modern age so much as it is an absolute reality. Women will marry men to fix them. How many times have I had brides say that or mumble it? They marry their men because they're going to fix them. He loves me, so he's going to change for me. Quit it. It's self-control. You're trying to control that person to become what you think they ought to be. And then when they come to me and say, this is not the person I married, I said, yeah, because you married an idea. You didn't marry the reality of the person. You look beyond the reality of the faults and the failings of that particular individual and married the idea. And now you're going to make him into that idea and you're going to destroy the marriage in the process. Dangerous, dangerous things, ladies. If you're married, don't worry, men are guilty of it too in a different way. Trying to control their brides, trying to own them, and so on and so on. Pride of the intellect, sins against faith. This is where darkness reigns in the intellect and the human being accepts false ideas and false notions. Pride of spiritual vanity. I'm perfect. I'm better than you. I'm in church every Sunday. I pray every day. I'm better than you. Pride of being cynical, ridiculing others, sarcastically using cutting words towards others. It's all pride. Pride of being pharisaical. Boastfulness, criticism of others. Oh, yeah, well, I know the truth better than you do. You can't, it's nothing you can tell me. I'm not going to listen to what you have to say. I know it better than you do, even though that person may be completely ignorant of the absolute truth. They may live in a darkened intellect, and they've made it their own, thinking that because they've done so, they're now living somehow in the light of God, but they're not. They're living in darkness. Remember our gospel that it reminds us to live in the light of Christ. It doesn't mean we carry a light bulb around. It doesn't mean I carry a candle around. It means I'm enlightened in my mind right here. My intellect is enlightened by God to truth, absolute truth. And many people today are afraid to use those words, absolute truth. Oh, well, Father, you can't really say that. I said, yes, I can. Because Christ himself said it. He's the truth and the way and the life. He founded one church, not 40,000, one. We're in it. I can proclaim absolute truth in his church. What's been passed down to us for 2,000 years. Pride of timidity comes from an unreasonable fear of other people's opinions. How many times have we lied and said things because we don't want to take the flack of what somebody might say about us? I often like to tell people, we look very pious in church. We look very good. Oh my God, don't meet me out in the street. Because you might find a finger or you might find a bullet. Who knows these days? It's crazy. Pride of superiority, scrupulosity, fixing one's attention on the wrong things. People, and I've run into people who actually do this, and they say to themselves, well, I'm better than most. I'm 99% better than most people. Quit it. When you stand before God, there'll be no percentages, by the way. And he's not going to say to you, well, you were living in a time where sin was very prominent and it was everywhere, but you were 99% better than everybody else. Well, I'm sorry. It's not going to get you through the pearly gates. You better give it 100% or give it nothing. You better give it everything you got if you want to get into heaven. Let's talk about the capital sin of anger. Yeah, I got time. It hasn't been that long. I know people like to think, oh, Father started his homily already. No, he didn't. I'm just reminding you what I said last year. I want to talk about the one capital sin that's plaguing mankind today most dominantly. Anger. You meet it everywhere you go, including in us, Christians, who practice our faith. Anger. You travel in the airport, and I just came back from preaching a retreat down south. You see it everywhere you go. Anger just seems to be there. Part of the problem, I think, is that the human being today is around angry people. Children are brought up with anger in their homes. So they come up with this anger already deeply ingrained within their souls. Because their parents are not refraining from yelling and screaming at each other in front of them. Because the parents are angry at yelling at the kids, and the kids yelling back at the parents. And parents, try to remember something. When you're surprised by the way your kids behave, look at yourself. Look at yourself. Your children only take from what they see in front of them. If you're yelling and screaming and throwing tantrums at you're angry and stuff, guess what they're going to do? If you teach them with kindness and charity and compassion and patience and so on, you teach them that there's another way. There's another way to live one's life. Anger is also a particular emotion of the soul. It's one of the 6 concupiscible appetites of the soul, one of the lower emotions of the human being, controlled actually by the cardinal virtue of temperance, which means we need to have the cardinal virtue of temperance in order to have any control over our anger. It is a weakness of the soul, and it often proceeds from something real or imaginary. We think that somebody has offended us in some way or another. It is opposed to charity and justice, but some people get angry for no reason at all. It's just, they like being angry. It's like a baby blanket that wraps itself around them, and they're just angry. I had some parishioners in one of my parishes that, you could see the anger in their faces. And then after Mass, they would come at me with both feet and both fists. And I knew I was in deep doo-doo. It's time to me to get out of there. So I kind of cut around the corner of the building, went back to the sacristy and locked the door, but they're always angry. Nobody likes to be around an angry human being. Quit it. If you have friends that are angry, you probably don't like to spend a whole lot of time with them. People that are gentle and compassionate and kind are much easier to be around. Anger is a nasty, nasty emotion and a nasty sin and fault or vice. It all depends on how we give into it. We have given way to anger and hate when we harbor resentment in our heart against certain persons or persons. And oftentimes in confession, I can't forgive that person, because I don't want to forgive that person is what it really comes down to. But a person will have all the excuses in the world while they hold on to unforgiveness, yet they expect God to forgive them. When we plot harm for anyone by word or deed, when we're using insulting language towards others, we are guilty of anger when we become excited and incensed to such a degree that we strike or hurt another, when we wrangle and quarrel violently with another, and when by sullen expression on our face or by our silence we show resentment towards that person. Our sin is very, very serious if we harbor rancor or hatred in our heart for days, months, even years. You want me to repeat that? How many of us have held on to anger since we were little kids towards somebody? Whether it's an adult, whether it's another child on the playground, it doesn't matter. That anger is just expressed and it just stays there. I'll give you a little secret about anger. It's not much of a secret, but it's a secret anyways. And you need to pay attention in yourself. When you practice being angry, even at an age when you were young and it grows with you, you will respond to most things angrily. And it will cover everything and anything. It doesn't matter whether it's done through reason, through ignorance, through stupidity, or whatever. If it's there, it's there. A person that is angry cannot think properly. This is why the devil loves two angry human beings, because he knows if he's got two angry human beings, he's got two brick walls. And when he's got two brick walls, he'll destroy them. What's the first thing that happens in marriages? Your fault. At that point in time, the problem is beginning. As your relationship unfolds, your marriage unfolds, that only gets worse. The yelling and the screaming and all that stuff comes with it. Pointing the finger at each other. And before you know it, we're in divorce court. We're another statistic. Instead of being an example to others in the way we live our married lives. Anger is destructive and highly injurious to others and to ourselves. A fit of rage deprives us of reason, like I said. It even estranges us from God. It separates us from friends and relatives. Anger clouds the intellect, like I said. It doesn't allow us to think reasonably. It is an unreasoning obstinacy. It makes us trample on the rights of others. Anger destroys peace and produces disastrous wars. Long before a war is ever fought anywhere on the face of the earth, it has been fought in the human heart by men before it ever comes to the surface. It causes all sorts of evils, discords, enmities, long-standing quarrels like the Hatfields and the McCoys, insults, spites, slander, blasphemy, hatred, revenge, murder, cursing, and so on and so on. All these things kill the virtue of charity within a human being. They're an obstacle to grace. Because grace is the greatest gift that God gives to us. Anger blinds the soul to what is just. When we're angry, we no longer see the just side of things. We just want to be angry. Anger can be overcome, but it takes time. Over the years, I've been a spiritual director to many people, religious communities, priests, deacons, you name it. But there have been some whose major problem and major vice was anger. It takes me on an average with a meeting of, let's say, every 2 weeks and focusing on one thing. It takes me an average of 2 years to help a human soul to overcome anger. Because we have to go all the way back to where that anger started. It isn't just the anger in the here and now. It's the anger that begun down here somewhere. When you were young, something made you angry. You didn't know what it was. You were just angry. But that anger grew with you. You began to realize it defended you. Anger is a defense mechanism that we use against others. It's also a way that we control others. We just get angry. If we don't want to answer a question, we'll just get angry. If we want to control another person, we just get angry. If we want to defend my position, I just get angry. We just do it. It's a very, very difficult vice to overcome. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't make an effort. We should try. We should try to practice gentleness, kindness, compassion, goodness towards others. Instead of giving in to the movements of rising anger, we must learn how to control ourselves, to have self-possession, a cardinal virtue of temperance. We must have that virtue. And St. Teresa of Avila tells us that it's the most singular, important virtue that controls the human being and all of his vices and all of his sins. So I know many people give things up for Lent, but how many people practice virtues? Something that makes them holy. Patience, gentleness, kindness, goodness, temperance, practicing it, justice, fortitude, so on and so on. We give up things that are useless because they don't change us. As soon as Easter comes, I'm back to it again, and nothing changed. I'm no better because of it. The things that I do during Lent are supposed to make me better, and it was a custom throughout the Middle Ages and right from the very beginning of the church. When you practice something during Lent, you never went back to it again for the rest of your life. We don't do that anymore. We just go right back to it, whatever it was. I have friends who give up beer and give up cigarettes and chocolates and so on and so on. But when it's Easter, we're right back to our beer and whatever else. Well, what good is all of that? Has it made you any better? Probably not. A spiritual writer says, gives an excellent advice. Always have within yourself a peaceful place where you may extinguish every movement of anger, and don't allow anger to cook in your brain. The problem is we allow stupid things to cook in our minds, and then you have this little mountain that an ant couldn't live in, that all of a sudden becomes a volcano that covers the entire face of the earth because I'm angry, because of this little itty-bitty problem. And this little itty-bitty word that might have been spoken out of context to me. And it just cooks and cooks and cooks in my brain until it begins to eat me alive. And before I know it, it's there for years. And we hold on to resentment and so on and so on. But to have a place where we can go. Humility, by the way, can absorb all anger. If we're humble enough, we can always absorb the anger of other human beings. So we need to practice humility. And the memory of an injury received must be gotten rid of. Confess it if you have to. Get rid of it. Once it's forgiven, it's done, it's finished. Get on with your life. To bring anger into check is to take a step toward bringing ourselves into subjection to God. An even temper brings others closer to us and hopefully allows within us to develop a spirit of quiet joy. A soft answer always turns away wrath. We need the grace of God for this one. We have to ask God. But we have to make an effort on a human level to practice self-possession. We must ask God to grant us calmness, tranquility, and peace, and to call upon Him quickly in times of temptation. We are naturally, in our broken nature, quick-tempered. And in our world today, it's everywhere. And I told you the story about some years ago. I was visiting a family's home, and they had just moved into this house, and there were boxes everywhere. And they were looking for their 4-year-old boy, and nobody could find him. So I went into the garage. I figured he was probably looking for some of his toys in his box, in the boxes there that had the name toys written on it. And I went through some of the boxes that were stacked up there, and there he was. And I said, "Hey, Matthew, what are you doing here?" And he turned towards me like he wanted to spit. He had a plastic sword in his hand. And he came at me and he tried to cut my knees out from under me. Of course, the plastic sword didn't hurt, and I laughed. But the point of it being, the anger that was on his face was ridiculous for a 4-year-old child. Because he couldn't find his favorite toy. Mom and Dad were always arguing in front of the kids. By the time he's 4 years old, he's got this emotion now growing in him. Unless he makes an effort to overcome it, it just gets worse. Anger doesn't stay neutral. Anger doesn't automatically decrease. It only grows. So we have to acknowledge it for what it is. Nobody wants to be around an angry person. And as St. Seraphim of Seraph once said, be a peaceful man, and you bring 1,000 souls to heaven.